Hello, it's Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Rick Reinhardt. He is a man after my own heart in a lot of ways, in that he has a mix of urbanism and religion. So he's a former chief of staff to a former mayor of Buffalo. He ran a business improvement district in Washington, D.C. He spent time with the Urban Land Institute, but he also spent several years working for the United Methodist Church, helping them sort through property issues. And he's really carved out a niche for himself as someone who's an expert on churches and real estate in urban areas, and what to do about all these empty churches and underutilized properties that we're facing. And he was gracious enough to join today to talk about it. So, Rick, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
You wrote an article last year that said, quote, a tsunami of emptying houses of worship, up to 100,000, according to one religious source, is washing across America, unquote. So explain to our listeners what's going on to kind of give them a base in the problem.
There's a great mismatch between small aging congregations and large deteriorating properties. So if you were to go to your neighborhood church, chances are anyway, that you'd see a large sanctuary with maybe 20 or 30 octogenarians in there. And inevitably, these churches, well, they're either going to sell or redevelop or be reused, or they're just going to go out of business, one or the other. The data on this nationally are not particularly great, but a couple of examples. The United Methodist Church in New Jersey, where I used to work, we rated our 530 churches. First, think about that, 530 United Methodist churches in a small state like New Jersey. And we found that 20% were in critical condition, should have been closed already, 40% in serious condition, right behind, and only 40% in fair to good condition. In my old hometown of Buffalo, the Roman Catholic bishop just announced the closing of 70, at least 70 churches all at once.
70?
Now, 70. Now, this is in the
Wow.
eight county Western New York area. And six out of the eight Roman Catholic dioceses in New York State have declared bankruptcy as a result of sexual abuse judgments, you know. But the fact is people weren't going anyway. So Western New York's going to see 70 Roman Catholic churches close all at once, some in city neighborhoods, some in small towns and villages. Finally, one of my favorite examples, Ottumwa, Iowa. That's the small town in Iowa where Radar O'Reilly from MASH was allegedly from. Eight of their downtown churches have closed over the last decade. Only three have been successfully redeveloped. The Main Street manager there fears that three more are going to close. So, this is the sort of thing that is really sweeping across America right now. It's not unique to any one denomination. It's not unique to any one geography. It's not unique to any one management system. It's just mainly that attendance, membership, contributions are falling off a cliff across the board.
Yeah, I seem to recall that the Pew Charitable Trust did a survey of churches in the city of Philadelphia that found very similar types of things. And a lot of these buildings are gorgeous, but man, renovating and maintaining those buildings is enormously costly.
It is. And, many in the faith business say that the reason for all of this is COVID 19. And I think COVID 19 did not do churches any favors, but there's really a lot of other reasons. One is there's just a decline in religiosity. My friend Ryan Burge, who's an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University, has figures that just show mainline Protestantism, Catholicism, non Orthodox Judaism attendance just crashing more than anything else. Also, building costs have been going up. Insurance costs have risen dramatically, utilities costs and the like. And then finally, the thing that I think is underappreciated is so many of these churches were built, Aaron, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, where the only way to get to church was to either walk or ride a horse. Well, since then, we have automobiles and mass transit, but we also have the internet. So if you'd like to follow the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Dalai Lama, all you have to do is open up your computer and push a button and follow it. So it used to be that the neighborhood church competed with nobody. Now, or only other churches in the neighborhood. Now, not only do they compete with churches within the region, they compete with churches globally.
Yeah, again, the thing about the cost, I made me think. This church I know in New York had a historic building, and they wanted to renovate it, and it ended up, I think, was $25 million, and that's a lot of money. And it wasn't a huge building. This wasn't like it was a mega church congregation. So they were fortunate to have some high net worth individuals in there who could make outsized contributions. But a lot of these buildings, even if they were packed for multiple services on a Sunday with, median income people, they're not going to raise tens of millions of dollars to renovate a historic building.
An old church in the North Camden neighborhood of Camden, New Jersey, big muscular stone church, has a slate roof. The church is on the National Register of Historic Places. The slate shingles are literally sliding off of the roof and coming crashing to the sidewalk. Not every day, but every now and then. By the grace of God, not killing somebody. To replace that roof is $2 million.
Yeah, just the
The
roof.
congregation, just the roof. And the congregation has a median age, I would say, of somewhere around 80, and there's 30 or 40 folks. The pastor retired and came back just to run this church. The future doesn't look good for that church.
Yeah, we're facing some challenges, and the reality is a lot of these are going to be converted to other uses. Um, I know there's been a lot more talk about these church buildings, and I just wonder, in your experience, when people start talking about churches, is it because they're interested in the congregation and helping the congregation and maybe helping this church survive as a church? Or is it more people who are interested in the land and the buildings and what else they could use with them, in terms of, well, we could do some affordable housing here, or we could, there's different things, what's it like when you look at the landscape of players between churches, denominations, cities, real estate developers, agencies that might want these places?
Aaron, just about everybody cares about the former. What are we going to do about the congregation? Because churches, in my opinion, have three important uses. First, they're places to congregate and worship. We all know that. But the second thing is they're places for offering human services. Partners for Sacred Places, a not for profit out of Philadelphia, estimates that the average urban church provides $140,000 a year worth of free services, not to their own mission, but to other entities which are using the church for either free or for a very low rate. And the third thing is churches are icons. I mean, take a look at a postcard, if there still are postcards anyway. Take a look at a postcard of any community, and the first thing you see are church steeples. When you're on the ground, you see these beautiful buildings. So losing a church isn't just losing a place for somebody to worship, it really goes across the community. Now, I think more and more, thank God, no pun intended, people are looking at the real estate and what to do with it. Now, that's been the case in New York, Toronto, Miami, San Francisco for a long time, where developers circle over the tops of churches that are going out of business like vultures, just waiting for them to close so they can turn them into luxury condos, at one time into offices and retail, but those are not such hot uses right now. We're in the heartland in my old hometown of Buffalo. The question is, what the heck are we going to do with the 70 church, Roman Catholic churches that the Roman Catholic bishop there has just announced are closing. And I think, particularly in Roman Catholicism, that's sweeping America. First, because people aren't necessarily going to church, but secondly, because of hundreds of millions of dollars of judgments against Roman Catholic dioceses for sexual abuse. So, 6 out of the 8 Roman Catholic dioceses in New York State have declared bankruptcy. People think that local churches have a lot of money. They really don't. What they have is a lot of real estate, and the only way they can satisfy these judgments is to sell it.
Yeah. And the Catholic Church always had too many churches because every ethnic group built its own church, even if they were right next to each other. It was like there's
Well,
the
well,
Italian
what?
church and there's the Irish church.
Well, one of my favorite stories is my mother was a McMahon. She was Irish American. And one day I asked her when I was a kid, why do we go to St. Patrick's Church and not one of the other churches? And she said, son, you don't understand. St. Patrick's is for the normal Irish. Most Holy Rosary is for the lace curtain Irish, and St. Lucy's is for the shanty Irish. So even with so even within ethnicities, even within, immigrants, there were different churches for different folks. And I mean, God forbid that our family should have gone to Most Holy Rosary or St. Lucy's.
Yeah. I'm going to start with an easy one. A lot of churches have way more land than they need. A lot of land that is either just empty or landscaping or parking lots that are now in areas that you might be able to do something with it. So right where I live in Carmel, Indiana, Carmel United Methodist, which I believe is the oldest congregation in the city, has a huge complex right on the main street, and there's no reason why they have to do anything with that land. I don't think they're in trouble or anything, but it's you know about 10% buildings and 90% parking lots and other stuff. How should churches think about all of this land that they've acquired over the years for parking lots and things?
Well, at the most basic level, there are some things that can be done. If instead of Carmel, Indiana, you talked about Bloomington, Indiana, or West Lafayette, Indiana, probably what those churches would have done was used it for parking for either Indiana or Purdue football or basketball games. And earn some revenue. I mean, that happens across America, in Iowa City, Auburn, and downtown Baltimore. When I go to an Orioles game, and I'm a Nationals fan, not an Orioles fan, but when I go, I park in a church parking lot. But there's a lot of other things that can be done. I mean, there's no need for them to all be paved. We can use other sorts of paving surfaces and use them for playgrounds, when they're not being used as parking lots. They can be used for victory gardens, community gardens, a lot of that property. But right now, the big national trend is to use that vacant land for affordable housing. America has a huge deficit of affordable housing. The Turner Center at the University of California at Berkeley has estimated that the amount of vacant land that churches and private or public universities have where affordable housing could be built is something like 6 times the size of the city of Oakland. But people don't do that. Across the Potomac, I'm in Rockville, Maryland. Just across the Potomac in Northern Virginia, several churches have partnered with not-for-profit affordable housing corporations and built literally hundreds of units of affordable housing on their land. Now, sometimes the church owns the affordable housing. Sometimes the church sells all of the property to a developer. Sometimes there's a joint venture. Sometimes the church does a land lease with a developer. Any one of those can work. Sometimes the original church has been demolished, and before people get into a fit about demolishing a church, a lot of churches were built in the late 50s, early 60s, late 60s, made out of cinder blocks and are, in my opinion, architectural abominations, really. So, it's okay to demolish some churches that don't have beauty or significance, but it's happening over and over. And right now, I'm working with the Episcopal dioceses in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are three of them, taking a look at their properties and trying to figure out which might work for what sort of uses. I want to double underline, not all church properties should become affordable housing. I mean, not all of the emptying ones should, because some don't make sense. With some, you'll be in court for 2 decades with neighbors suing, NIMBYs suing and whatever. But turning faith properties into affordable housing is a very, hot, trendy thing right now.
Yeah, that's actually what I was kind of hoping Carmel United Methodist might do at some point. There's a lot of high density kind of luxury developments going in around there, and we're in an affluent suburb where housing prices are not as high as they are in some parts of the world, but they're pretty high by Indiana standards, and something that seems mission aligned with the church and like affordable housing seems like something that could go along with sort of the mission of the church more so than say luxury condos or something like that. And so I'd actually like hope at some point maybe some of that land could be developed for for some type of affordable product, what however defined in that, because that's we're not going to build a lot of affordable housing here most likely, and so that'd be like the one of the rare opportunities to do it.
Well, it's also, we also like the fact that many states and municipalities have looked at ways of trying to incentivize houses of worship to develop affordable housing. So each of Washington State, California, and my home state of Maryland have passed statewide legislation giving benefits, without getting into all the details, and it changes from state to state, to faith institutions that wish to develop affordable housing. One of the things they do is they give zoning by right to those churches if they're going to develop 100% affordable housing, to avoid the NIMBY factor. With municipalities, Seattle, Portland, Pasadena, California, San Diego, San Antonio, Atlanta, New York City, Montgomery County, Maryland, and I just found out today the city of Charlotte have either passed legislation or developed programs where they help churches, houses of worship, try to figure out what to do with their property with incentives for affordable housing. Um, Now, the bad news is that for the most part across America, zoning for churches is abysmal. I mean, it comes out of the 1950s or 1960s. I'm working with the city of Newport News. Newport News has zoning that states a church must have 3 acres of land if it's going to be doing things with their land. And that comes out of many years ago when there was a large annexation. But it's crazy. I mean, for to require a church to have 3 acres of land in an urban area just makes no. Similarly, building codes tend not to make sense. Some friends at a Unitarian Universalist church in Silver Spring wanted to do renovations on their church to make it more possible for them to rent it out for non-religious meetings. And when they wanted to expand by 1,000 square feet, which is nothing,
Right.
they were told, well, you're going to have to institute a sprinkler system, and that's going to cost somewhere around $1 million. Finally, historic preservation regulations tend not to make much sense. At least until recently, if you were to use federal or following that state historic tax credits, not only could you not alter the external appearance of the church, you couldn't alter the internal sanctuary and chop it up. Well, how the heck are you going to turn a big sanctuary into affordable housing or even market rate housing without somehow subdividing that sanctuary into units. And with most of these developments, if you don't get the historic tax credits, the numbers don't work. So cities are really far behind in looking at their zoning. And I was chief of staff to a mayor. What to do about emptying churches when I was chief of staff probably wouldn't have made the list of the top 100 things that we were
Hmm.
worried about. We were worried about city budgets and police unions and overtime and sewers and water. And so, when I talk to the folks in my old hometown and say, hey, man, you've probably got, including the Protestant churches, 100 churches closing. I just get kind of a glassy eyed stare, yeah,
Hmm.
that's nice, but we've got so much that we're working on, we'll never get to it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that places are adjusting those some of those rules. For those who don't know, changing it to make it build affordable housing by right means they don't have to go to the city to get any rezonings. They have the legal right to do it without having the city council have to vote a politically contentious thing with a lot of neighbors who don't want it to do it. So that's very important to be able to do things by right, if at all possible.
And cities are a little between the devil and the deep blue sea, Aaron, on this issue, because on the one hand, they desperately want to build more affordable housing, but on the other hand, they don't want the big bad state telling them what they can and can't do.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely more of a trend towards states getting involved. So we'll see how that plays out. You know,
Yeah, I should also add Hawaii, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, Kentucky, South Carolina, Virginia, and New York have introduced such legislation. In some cases, it's been voted down. In some cases, it's still under consideration. Often, this legislation takes 2 or 3 years before it finally gets passed. But you'll notice it's not just blue states that are considering this, it's red states as well. And I don't really look at this as a Democrat or Republican issue. I mean, in some ways, I know that the current administration, having the current federal administration, they want to help churches do development.
one of my observations is in a lot of these cities, there's a lot of historic congregations that own property and often have amazing buildings that are dying, and then there are these kind of newer, more vibrant churches, either immigrant churches or evangelical churches that are in rented space. They don't own buildings. And I know sometimes that through mergers or other things, there have been things where like new congregations have come in and kind of taken over. But it seems like a lot of people, a lot of churches and denominations would almost rather sell the land to a developer than have another church take it over. What are you seeing in that?
Well, down the street from me in Rockville, Maryland, Twin Brook Baptist Church was getting smaller and smaller. And the congregation voted to sell their church, but to sell it at half price, half of market value, to a Hispanic church that was also meeting there, and to take the other half of the money and give out grants, not just to religious entities in the Rockville community, but to all sorts of entities. In the city of Buffalo, three of the Catholic churches that have been closed have been sold to Muslims. Buffalo has a great influx of Burmese and Bangladeshis, and so Muslims have bought three of them. But often, particularly Roman Catholics, do not like selling to, let's call them competing sorts of denominations or ones that may believe in different things. It's really interesting. I'm sorry I'm coming up with all these Buffalo examples, but there's
No,
a
it's
lot
great.
going on.
Buffalo's great, by
But
the way. If
they're
you've never been to Buffalo, you get a chance to go to Buffalo. Don't pass it up. It's a city with amazing character. Amazing character.
abs and characters too.
Yes.
But but the Roman Catholic Diocese closed a seminary in East Aurora. East Aurora is the poshest suburb of Buffalo. They put it on the market. The Masons decided they wanted to buy it for senior housing. And the diocese suddenly took the property off of the market because they didn't want, I mean, the last thing the Catholics wanted to do was to sell to the Masons. Well, subsequent to that, the US federal bankruptcy court judge has said, thou shalt start turning your illiquid assets into liquid assets to pay, the judgments. And so they put the property for the seminary on the market. The highest bidder was a Korean cult, which, because of the court, the Catholics have had to sell that to the Korean cult. I don't
Hmm.
use the term loosely either. I've read a lot about them. So, a lot of times you're right. I mean, there's another case in North Carolina where the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church sold a small rural church through a realtor to an entity. The entity ended up being Nazis, and
Hmm.
I mean that's the thing. When you sell property, often you don't know who you're really selling it to. People can then resell it. You just don't know. So the former bishop down there, who's a friend, got blamed for selling the church. Well, they didn't know who they were selling it to. So it's a little tricky. I mean, that's for sure. And neighbor. One thing about churches, the neighbors always have opinions.
Right. What are some of the other barriers to doing something with this property? For example, I think like with the Methodist Church, it's extremely complex mix of congregational and denominational control over property that makes Methodist churches particularly difficult to sell. I mean, what do you see in kind of
Aaron,
that? What are the barriers out there?
you're pointing out something that's really important and that people just don't understand. The Roman Catholics and the Latter day Saints Church are all very top down. That is what the bishops, or in the case of the Latter day Saints, what the folks in Salt Lake City decide, that's what goes. At the other end of the spectrum, the Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ, the Jewish faith, and interestingly enough, the Baptists are all very bottom up. It's almost as if there is no what we call a judicatory. Judicatory is
Right.
a fancy word for diocese or presbytery or conference. And so the decisions get made very much at the sub local level. I mean, the congregation, and sometimes the congregation is like 6 or 8 people, end up making the decision. The mainline Protestant denominations, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodist, Presbyterians, are what I would call an awful combination of both top down and bottom up. I mean, as you pointed out, so there really almost needs to be a consensus between what the bishop wants, the bishop and the treasurer, and what the congregation wants. And I have scars and bruises to show you on this from the United Methodist Church. When a bishop wants something done, chances are the local congregation doesn't. When the local congregation wants to do something, chances are the bishop doesn't want to do it. It's sort of like the executive branch and the legislative branch
Mm.
in government. They're sort of set up to disagree with each other, and it can just become extremely complicated. Another huge complication, of course, which I mentioned already a bit, is zoning, building codes, and historic preservation ordinances. And behind that, NIMBYs, folks who state not in my backyard and will sue to the ends of the earth to prevent a church from becoming something else, particularly affordable housing or a homeless shelter or anything that generates a lot of traffic. They really don't like it. And it's a really kind of nice situation if you live in a neighborhood to have kind of a sluggish, dopey church down the street because it's beautiful. It doesn't generate much traffic. I mean, except maybe one day a week. And the kids can play on the lawn and play in the parking lot. Where the problem comes in is when the church actually closes. And I took George Kelling's course on broken windows when I was at Harvard. The windows start breaking and the vandals come in and the squatters come in and the place becomes dangerous. But it's really a comfortable situation to live down the street from a sluggish church.
What do cities think about this? I know you mentioned all the things churches do, but on the other hand, churches are tax exempt. And I used to live in Evanston, Illinois, and it's like the city of churches, but everybody always complained that 55% of the city's property was tax exempt, with Northwestern University and then all these churches, most of them which probably don't have that many people attending there anymore. How do cities think about this issue of church property and distressed churches?
Listen, Aaron, when I was chief of staff to the mayor, the number in Buffalo was 46%. It wasn't quite as bad as Evanston. And also remember, in addition to the uses you're talking about, there's hospitals, there's government buildings, the list goes on and on. And we were in favor of, I shouldn't say just about anything, but many, many things that would take a tax exempt property and put it on the tax rolls, because we had to pay for the police and the firefighters and the teachers, and that's not an easy thing to do. So on the one hand, city administrations and councils would like to see these properties come on the market. On the other hand, there's often a need to preserve the not for profit uses of these churches, particularly when it comes to places for Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous to meet, food pantries, clothing closets, health clinics. I mean, you can go right down the list. So many of those meet in churches. In Long Branch, New Jersey, we had a United Methodist Church that had about a dozen people in the congregation. It wasn't even coming close to paying its own way. But on the other hand, twice a week they handed out food and fed literally hundreds of families. So it would have been bad for us to even think about closing it. By the way, you might ask, well, did those dozen people staff the food pantry? No, of course not. Everybody in the community came together to the church, including city employees, to hand out the food. So there's things are a little schizophrenic there, I would say. In general, what cities are, though, is asleep, just totally asleep on this issue. They don't understand that, a third of their churches are going to be going out of business.
Yeah. Yeah, you make me think there that Carmel United Methodist I mentioned has a food pantry operation, which you don't think of affluent suburbs as needing food pantries, but believe it or not, there are a lot of people who are rent burdened and things in the community and so they are providing a lot of services, especially in a red state like Indiana. It's a little more parsimonious on public sector public services and social
Well, and also
services.
think about what just went on in the Texas Hill Country.
Yeah,
Um, Churches respond to emergencies for shelters, food. They put up the first responders. I mean, you name it. And there are churches that really have that culture within them.
yeah. So if somebody's listening here, they're from a church or a denomination, and they can't maintain their property, and maybe they can see they're on a trajectory that they might not make it as a going concern. What would your advice be to them about how to think about their property in a scenario like that?
None of these congregations want to close. And why not? Well, it's where their parents were buried from. It's where their kids were baptized. It's where they were married, and there's great emotion behind all of this. But somewhere along the line, I don't want to say the emotion needs to be put aside because it shouldn't be, but one has to take a look at the data. They have to look at the numbers. How many people are going there? What is the age? What are the capital needs of that church in terms of repairs and replacement? So many pastors have said to me something along the lines of, "We are one new roof away from closing." And I think folks in congregations, they should want the closing of the church to be on their own terms, not to go from 2 dozen to a dozen to half a dozen to a couple of people, and then have the bishop close them and then hire Keller Williams to pound a sign out front and sell it to whoever happens to come along. They should want to do things their own way. And often, one of the things that can be done is to use their church property for things in addition to their congregations. Again, down the street from me, Veers Mill Baptist Church proudly proclaims that in addition to their own congregation, they host 4 other congregations in the church. And all of them are immigrants of one kind or another. And, that's just great. In other cases, you can put a coffee shop on the first floor. In some other cases, you can take part of your property and put up affordable housing. And that might not save your congregation, but it could postpone what happens by a decade or something like that. Too many people get in the mindset of, well, all we need is a new pastor. And if we only could have a new pastor like the one who we had 30 years ago, then we could revitalize our congregation. And that's just, for the most part, magical thinking. I'm not going to say it never happens, but it might happen 1 out of 1,000 times. So I think gathering the data is really important. Number two, it's really important to know your appointed and elected officials. All too often, I've discovered churches where you say, well, who's your mayor? And they don't know. Well, who's your council member? They don't know. Have you ever talked to the planning director or the permitting director? No, we haven't. In one case in St. Petersburg, City Hall was literally across an alley, and they had never, or they hadn't in the last several years anyway, had the mayor or council people into the church. Well, Aaron, these are politicians. Like, they like seeing and being seen and shaking hands and giving speeches and things like that. Get to know those people, and it's really important. And then I think third, finding out who might be good partners, affordable housing developers, other not for profits, other congregations that might be interested in sharing your church. A really good matches have been made between mainline Protestant churches and Seventh day Adventist or Jewish congregations, because they tend to meet on Saturdays, not Sundays. I mean, just for instance, there are not for profit food pantries, food banks, health clinics that might be interested in your space. And I think it's important not to lease out that space. People kind of mix up the idea of, at one end of the spectrum, mission, and at the other end of the spectrum, money. That is, they'll give out their space free to things that are worthy, but that doesn't bring in the cash necessarily that's needed to keep your place going. So it's really important to do the research on what folks are paying for space that might be childcare or health clinics or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Jewish congregations because I know in New York City it's the opposite. There are Christian churches that are renting from synagogues because the synagogue's out of use on Sunday, and they're facing
Right.
some of the same issues with money in very very large buildings. I guess the last question would be: what resources do you have that you might want to refer people to so they could read more of your work, or it doesn't have to all be your work, but you tell us about them now, and then I'll put links to them in the show notes.
Sure. Well, there's about 8 or 10 folks who've written books on the issue of reuse and redevelopment of churches. My friend Mark Elsden, who's out of Madison, Wisconsin, his most recent book is called Gone for Good, question mark. And he had 19, I think the number is, different people write chapters in the book about the various issues that we've talked about. I've written, this sounds a little pathological, Aaron, but you're a writer, so it isn't pathological to you. I've published 33 articles on this issue over the last 4 years, including the cover article with my co-author, Nadia Mian, who's a professor at Rutgers, in Planning Magazine, another article in Urban Land Magazine, and I think 3 or 4 articles in Governing Magazine, which I know you're very familiar with and have
Yeah,
written
yeah,
a
I'm a
few
contributor
things
there.
yourself. No, I know.
Hmm.
It's a great resource. I've written a few for faith-based periodicals. Well, I'll tell you something that's really ironic. The public policy and urban planning and city management folks can't get enough of articles on this issue. The religious folks, there's a couple of periodicals that are really interested in this, and a bunch of the rest of them just ignore it. I mean,
Hmm.
they're really in denial. It's a little crazy, actually. I mean, if you would have told me 4 years ago that the public policy people will have a thirst for this issue and the religious folks won't want to have anything to do with it, I would have told you were crazy. But
Hmm.
I will send you some links.
Yeah, yeah. We'll be sure to put some of your greatest hits in there. We won't make everybody read 33 articles, but we'll put some of the top ones in there and a link to that book as well for people to learn. Because you say, I do think, having been part of a church where like a new pastor did actually reboot a dead congregation, I know it happens, but is it going to happen 100,000 times?
No,
In the next 5 years.
and the demographics have to be
Yeah,
there
yeah,
even for that to happen.
yeah,
Often a pastor has repelled people, and so someone can come in and bring them back. But you got to look at the numbers. You really
yeah.
have to look at the numbers.
All right. Well, today's guest has been Rick Reinhardt. He is an expert on churches and real estate and in cities, the intersection of that. Look in the show notes for some of his articles and other researches on the topic. Rick, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Aaron. Really enjoyed it.